Hello, everyone. Is this on? Is this working? Yeah? Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome back from our lunch break. I hope you had some great pizza. Um, I'm here to introduce our last panel, after which we'll have a kind of break and then go into a workshop, which we're all really excited about because it's going to give everyone here an opportunity, should they wish, to participate and make their voice heard. It'll be great to hear from everyone. So I'm introducing the last panel, which is Institutional Timing, the Life and Death of the Institution. We have four panelists, Thomas Boutoux from Castillo Corrales, and I will keep my introductions brief as well, but he's editor, writer, and curator, co-founder of Castillo Corrales and Paraguay Press. After Thomas, we will hear from Dulcie Abrahams Altass. She is a curator of programs at Raw Material Company, the car. She is speaking on behalf of Raw Material Company in the place of Koyo Kuyo. Our third panelist will be Prem Krishnamurthy, who you guys all totally know at this point. And last, we will hear from 1857, Steffen and Stian. I can't even try to pronounce Steffen's last Handlin and Stian Eide Kluge. So with that, I would like to ask Thomas to come up and tell us a bit about Castillo Corrales.
Oh, I forgot about the image. Hi, everyone. I wrote a little something because when I improvise, I just by the end of of my introduction, there is someone who shows me a sign and it's over. So for once, I wrote a little something. It's very oral, and I'm going to try to do it the new way because I realized that you don't come with your laptop anymore. You come with your cell phone. So David, Joao, Luis were doing this. I don't know if I can do it because I'm a little older than all of you, and so maybe this is a bad idea. We'll see. And I'm already in for like 2 minutes, so I should start. So yeah, time span, life and death, when to close, where to start. Like New Theater and Kala, we closed the space of Castillo Corrales at the end of 2015 after a little more than 8 years that were fast-paced, chaotic, but extremely fun ones. They were really important, decisive, transformative years for all of us who were involved in this project. And by the end of it, we were around like 10 or 12. Castillo Corrales started basically as a shared office space and became a collectively run project, first in a very tiny space in Belleville in Paris, and then in a slightly bigger, but still considered like a small, very small space in the same neighborhood. We were doing a lot. By the end of these 8 years, there was a continuous exhibition and events program in the space where we were also running a bookstore called Section 7 Books and a publishing house called Paraguay Press. And we had 2 ongoing series of publications. So by the end of like 2015, 2 ongoing series of publications, one called The Social Life of the Book and the other called Castillo Corrales Today. We were also doing projects outside of the space in Paris, and that year, in 2015, we did this swap with a Portland institution called Yale Union. So we decided to exchange everything, keys, computers, passwords, and to go there, the group of us, or the group of went there, and they came to Paris during the summer. It was like a summer swap, and we organized shows and spent holidays in 2 countries. The same year, we did also freeze projects, something that we had resisted to do for many years, and finally we decided to do it. And in 2015, it was also, I'm probably forgetting a lot of the other things that we did that year, but we also organized this infamous dance party outside of the space in the outskirts of Paris, which was like Martin's Beck project to reenact the loft last evening, last night. It was called last night, and so we organized it. So was it we closed because we're doing too much, because it got out of hand, and we went through what is commonly referred and probably lazily used today as some kind of like burnout situation. There was probably a bit of this, of course, but it's more complicated than that, and I hope more interesting to tell and to reflect on and to share here. So I'm going to tell a different story, not a sad story of exhaustion, of collapse, economical or psychological, and of something that we had to stop doing reluctantly. It's something that was very dear to us and that we had stopped to do. We stopped to do reluctantly. So this is not the story I'm going to tell you today. I have to say also that it wasn't une décision unanime, unanimous. I don't know if it's this unanimous. Thank you. Decision either. And as Chris Kraus put it very well this morning, and Castillo Corrales being first and foremost a collective project before being a space, and even like an experiment in being a collective, and we managed to do this for 8 years. By the end of it, so in 2015, let's say, the conversation between us wasn't as smooth, as productive, as mainly productive than it used to be. But despite this fact, the end of Castillo Corrales is not either a story of friendship that crumbled and ended. So this is not a sad story. When the space closed, we decided to continue independently the projects of the bookstore and of the imprint Paraguay. One part of the group went to continue Paraguay, the other the bookstore. And they're both doing great today, 2019. Section 7 Books is now called After 8 Books, and just opened like a couple of weeks, a month ago, in a very beautiful space in the center of Paris after like 2 years of being in another space, in a smaller space. And it's really beautiful. And I think and for me, it's like, since I'm no longer part of it, it's finally possible for me to say, I think it's one of the best art bookstores in the world. Paraguay, which I'm still a part of, has never been as active as today. And it's really exciting thing to do. We have like many books. We published many books this year. We have many in the pipes, and so it's very active. And so I think both groups are very happy with the situation right now. Sorry. It is not a sad story because I think we managed to close before we got bad. The music band analogy has been quite valid with Castillo Corrales throughout the life of the project. And we certainly didn't want to be that kind of band that makes too many albums and embarrassingly repeating themselves and stop being inspiring for younger bands. I think we could see this coming and we stopped at the right time. But more importantly, we stopped because after years of being like freewheeling, self-willed, self-inventing, I think quite bold in what we were doing, we kind of figured out the formula for the space to continue. And in a way, figuring out at some point this more effective formula for the project by organizing a yearly benefit, by planning more ahead. I mean, things that we should have found out much earlier, but we were not able to do it for some reason. This suddenly made the project far less exciting, adventurous, and I think this is what made the conversation between us less inspiring. So we found this formula, and the most important point I want to make here, and I think this is relevant for this conference, is that what did I say? The most important point I want to make is that a lot of what our spaces are doing we're being very self-reflexive. We think about how and why we're doing the things we're doing, which is great. And I think this is what distinguishes with many, more classical or long-term institutions. But sometimes this self-reflexivity becomes a bit like a self-obsession. And I think, it's sometimes it's self-obsessed, self-satisfied, and self-referential. And to me, this is maybe the problem of this conference. I mean, not the problem, but this is, what these spaces are about. And so we end up like talking a lot about what we do, and maybe not as much as the context of what we were doing. And 2015, Paris was a very peculiar year context-wise for us. It was a time when it felt that things couldn't continue as business as usual, like the attacks in January and in November, the city becoming more and more economically polarized also. And by now, like 4 years after, it's insane. It's like the prices, the rent prices have went up. And so we've been living in Paris also, similar situations as in other cities, but we could see this, it was the beginning of this happening. So the feelings that things larger than what we were doing were at stake, and that contemporary art, despite its overblown claims sometimes, well, I can't do much, or our space couldn't do much, to just like undo this kind of forces that were at play. So there needed to be something more than that, or at least there needed to be something different to be done. Without knowing what that might be, but in order to know, you need to stop, I think, being completely focused on the task at hand, and especially when there is so much pressure to keep a space running like daily. The economic side, especially. I mean, as I said, we were like 10 or 12 of us doing the project by the end of Castillo Corrales. And we were not, I mean, it was like there were different generations. So for instance, the founders, we all had jobs. It was like a part-time activity. We were all like teachers, let's say, more of us. But the younger one who were, I mean, it was a nice thing about this project. It's like we had interns that stayed for years, and that made the space really interesting. But in 2015, I think we felt a responsibility towards this like younger generation, that it was not possible, it was not viable in a way to continue dedicate so much time and energy to a project like Castillo Corrales in Paris. So I feel much more comfortable now with doing the press, with publishing. There is less of an immediacy, there is less of a business as usual. It has so many different possible, the press has so many different possible paces. You can work on a book for 5 years and even not do it at the end. It's not important. Practical solutions can be found by plenty of ways for each project. You don't need to have like a formula that exists. And the coherence, and this is where I want to end, the coherence of an imprint is also something that you can deal with much more quietly, I think, than with a space. You don't need to be as much self-reflexive. You don't need to come up with descriptions of what you do. And you're basically never invited to talk about it in these, in such conferences and settings. Voilà ce que je voulais dire.
I hope that you can hear me okay. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'll get to it, but it's a very generative moment in Raw Material Company's life to be at this conference and talking and hearing with so many other independent art institutions. So thank you very much for the invitation, and yeah, it's a real pleasure, although it's a shame about the weather. Next time we'll do it in Dakar. So I will begin by just explaining what we do at Raw Material Company. and then I will approach the theme of the panel from a couple of different perspectives. So we are a Center for Art, Knowledge and Society based in Dakar, Senegal. RAW was founded as a project in 2008 before becoming a physical space in 2011. And its genesis can best be understood as responding to an urgent need in Dakar for a space of critical reflection on artistic practice and its symbiotic relationship with society. While Dakar was already renowned for its biennial and lively artistic scene and history, there was nowhere in the city that the notion of art as being generative of knowledge in relation to the most pressing societal issues of our time could be explored, discussed, and expanded on. It therefore became paramount to build an independent institution that could contribute to reformulating society's relationship to art in Dakar, but in constant collaboration and dialogue with the rest of the African continent and allies across the globe. So across two sites, the main center, which you can see in the image, which is a former residential villa, and Cœur Issa, which is our residency. We're involved in curatorial practice, public forums, artistic education through our RAW Academy, residencies, knowledge production, exhibitions, symposia, international collaborations, and the archiving of theory and criticism on art. The program is transdisciplinary and is equally informed by literature, film, architecture, politics, fashion, cuisine, and diaspora. It works to foster the appreciation and growth of artistic and intellectual creativity in Africa, and we strive to engage with creative practice and forms of knowledge that exist around us but may not be traditionally integrated into the field of art. From 2011 until 2015, our programmatic focus was exhibition making. These were always exhibitions that played with the links between art and society. And included, for example, Chronicle of a Revolt that archived in real time the peaceful uprising that took place in Senegal in 2012 in the run-up to the presidential elections. And another example is Word, 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 Issa Samb and the Undecipherable Form, a solo exhibition of the multifaceted practice of seminal Senegalese artist Issa Samb. As of October 2016, after 5 years of exhibition making, Raw Material Company made the decision to channel a greater proportion of it into artistic education, recognizing that School of Fine Art, that there is no art history program at the university, there is no curating program, and the School of Fine Art in of itself is very under-resourced financially and in terms of human resources. So extensive research and deep study of the landscape of art education in Africa and beyond led to the inception of RAW Academy, which ran its first session in late 2016 and takes place in 2 distinct sessions of 7 weeks each per year. So like others gathered here, we are invested in a capacity to respond to an ever-shifting landscape and to search for new ways to bring complexity, richness, and criticality into both a local and global context. We strive to make visible the highest standards of inquiry and creativity that exist in Senegal, and to models from field into dialogue with our environment, being porous to new models of institutional practice in a quest of constant trial, and we hope no error. And this is going to lead me now into the theme of this panel and the question of success, because what's burning, I think, underneath the title of this panel is this question of mortality of institutions. And I wanted to bring something up that I won't go into here, but maybe we can talk about during the discussion, which is failure and who is allowed to fail. Because I don't think that we can allow ourselves to fail at Raw Material Company. And that's not to say that the death of an institution is a failure. And that's something that I would like us to maybe unpack in the discussion. But where disappearance or closing the doors is not a possibility in our eyes. It's thought-provoking to be on this panel, as I mentioned, because has not died, but it has gone through transitions. The latest, which is our founding artistic director, Koyo Kuo, who has recently taken up the position of chief curator at the Zatzmoka Museum in Cape Town. And so it's a moment of growth for the team and maybe new directions, but a reorganization. So there are a couple of aspects of our work that I want to draw on and that I hope will open out this discussion on institutional life and death. The first being why I argue for survival in the context of Dakar. And I will try to do this without being self-aggrandizing as well. But in Dakar, institution building is risky business. There is a distinct lack of state support, if any at all, for independent institutions. And funds are dominated by those coming from diplomatic or development bodies, which denature a lot of creative practice and develop this project by project funding model. So it's quite hard in Dakar to create an institution that people can rely on, and that where there is the potential for long-term collaboration with the audience. We have a weekly public program that's been going on since 2011. And that means that our doors are open to the public. They're open to the public from Monday to Friday, but really as a discursive forum, week in, week out. And that's something that's quite unique in our landscape and something that is worth protecting. Of course, and I'll come back to this, we have to be flexible in our form. But I do think that the reliability and the accountability that therefore we have to our local audience is fundamental. We're not the only ones who can do this, but we also have relationships to practitioners and institutions beyond our context, and us, the role that we play in between those two worlds is also quite interesting. And we're cognizant of the role that we play in the continuity of larger communities of practice, as our friend and collaborator, Ferdi from Kunci in Yogyakarta describes it. So, of course, to survive makes no sense. But to survive whilst being useful, this is okay, I think. And there are different ways in which institutions can try to survive and to try to best survive. One of the ways that we've done this at Raw Material Company is taking an institutional sabbatical. So it's interesting to hear Kunsthalle Lisbon talking earlier about trying to have a year off. We did this in 2015 after 4 years of intense exhibition making. And it became necessary when it became apparent that this format was not necessarily best serving our local audience and our international audience, nor ourselves, that we needed to be able to rethink what we were doing, and that was impossible whilst continuously opening the doors every day and doing that in a way that works and is useful. So we closed shop for a year and researched and built the academy program. The institutional sabbatical, of course, was only made possible by having funders who would let us do that. And this battle to work with funders who appreciate and understand our way of working is also really important for not just our survival, but thinking about how we can help other institutions to survive while practicing new ways of working. And the institutional sabbatical now exists as a principle within the Arts Collaboratory Network that we're part of as a time strike. So where independent organizations that are part of the network can take time to stop their public programming and to do deep study, deep reflection, to rest. And so that's that's helpful. And then I see that time is running out, so I just wanted to talk about how also we can continue to be malleable, as has come up, and responsive. And one of the other ways is that we really consciously cultivate new generations of the Raw family. We have a small and young team that's partly and quite organically drawn from our Raw Academy program. I myself wouldn't be here today if that wasn't the case. I was a fellow in the first Raw Academy, and we continue to work with fellows who want to stay in Dakar, or who I had a prior relationship to Dakar as it was. But this knowledge and understanding that we need to nurture the intellectual and professional growth of the people who we were with the team, and that this is a virtuous circle that then feeds back to the intellectual and professional growth of the institution. So while in this sense, while Koyo has only recently moved to Cape Town, it's only a month ago that she took up her new post, we can see the transition, this generational transition at Raw, having been underway for some time, because the team is really encouraged to grow, to travel, to develop their own projects. And we also practice frequently within the team the principle of knowledge sharing. So I will go back after this conference, and I will present to the team on what happened here in the conversations. To conclude, I wanted to invite us to another card to maybe put on the table for the panel discussion. It comes from the title Bande. And it's been really interesting to hear, and Thomas spoke about this briefly in his presentation, is how we've been going through the modus operandi of our different institutions, but in the title of this is Bond, and maybe an invitation to think further about our relationships with one another, because certainly Raw Material Company as an institution, as I mentioned earlier, being part of different communities of practice, is very, very invested in a number of communities. And I think we can see ourselves here as part of a community. And so beyond our own ways of working, what do we represent when we're banded together as we are here, is maybe something we can discuss further. Thank you very much.
Since we didn't do a power pose, I'll just kind of stand here myself, because I get nervous before these things. So, well, I think it's a useful construct that, as well as being the co-organizers of this, Rhea, Chris, and I also are subjected to some of the same constraints and formats in terms of giving a talk. And I think it hopefully also exposes our own underlying position, our subjectivity, our biases, our reasons for doing this, and make them available for productive discussion. So I'm here to speak about P exclamation, sometimes pronounced as P, depending on how energetic I'm feeling on a given day. Yeah, I'm going to speak about it a bit in the past tense, but also in the future tense. And I'm going to read a bit. I move between reading and extemporaneous, but having so many thoughts and so many great presentations also to reflect upon, I feel like I'll be a little more focused if I actually just read a thing I wrote about 3 or 4 weeks ago and then continue from there. So P was a quixotic experiment of an institution. The idea to open a space in New York City's Chinatown had been brewing for a while, but it manifested itself somewhat suddenly in 2012. By that point, I had run my design studio, Projects, for over 8 years in New York, building deep relationships with artists, architects, alternative spaces, and established institutions. As an exhibition space, P exclamation manifested a growing sense that the commonplace modes of exhibition making and institution building in New York City needed questioning, particularly regarding approaches to exhibition display and exhibition histories, collaborative roles between artists, curators, and designers, the blurry economic boundaries between, quote, nonprofit spaces and the commercial art world, as well as the mixing of different modes and disciplines. The space synthesized many years of conversations into a single program. My original mission statement from summer 2012 is worth reading here as it captures the space's initial ambition, sensibility, and strategies. P proposes an experimental space of display in which the radical possibilities of disparate disciplines, historical periods, and modes of production rub elbows. A freewheeling combination of project space, commercial gallery, and Mom and Pop Kunsthalle, P exclamation, engages with presentation strategies and models to emphasize rupture over tranquility, interference over mere coexistence, transparency over obfuscation, and passion over cool remove. I'll mention here, I remember when I put that out in 2012, I remember a critic in New York who was a friend. He said, why the hell are you writing that as a statement to put forward publicly? He just thought he said, it's claiming too much, it's too specific, and it's locking yourself into something. And he may have been right, but it was the way that I went about trying to frame what the goals were and maybe keep myself accountable to those things over the course of its lifespan. So as this mission performed itself, P exclamation underwent several key transformations, evolving with my own thinking and experience. These institutional micro epics and curatorial cycles were occasionally called out explicitly, but more often they were internal mechanisms for structuring the program in multiple sequences with an associative logic. I thought of the curatorial program as constituting itself not only within each individual exhibition, but over time through the syncopation of shows. The entire program had a narrative arc with connections that emerged slowly and echoing over years. As an added provocation, and very germane to the specific topic of this panel, midway through its program in early 2015, P suddenly and abruptly changed its name to K period. So went from P exclamation to K period, and it was the same space, but it was completely renovated and changed in the way it looked, to the point that some people who had been there multiple times actually claimed that I had moved, though in fact the space had not moved. It had simply changed its appearance. And it used entirely different language about itself too. Whereas beforehand, P had called itself, this combination of a project space, commercial gallery, and Mom and Pop Kunsthalle. Never used it kind of also tended to shy away from the word gallery. Tended to call itself an exhibition space. K period called itself a new gallery in the Lower East Side. And this was a very specific rhetorical move, moving from an exhibition space in Chinatown to a new gallery in the Lower East Side without changing spaces. And that was for a specific cycle of 6 month cycle of shows. And the name change was also sparked by, as many things are, by conversations with other people. In this case, the artist Christopher Coulendron Thomas, who, though he never explicitly appeared in any text of P or K, actually wielded an enormous influence and was part of the first show there under a pseudonym or as part of a collaboration. And so this 6 month cycle of shows that called itself K period was a fast-paced 2-week shows that looked at and performed the life and death of a New York gallery. And so they looked at economic systems. The first show actually sold financial instruments as opposed to artworks, and kind of proposed speculative models for thinking about finance, and then closed at the end of it. And so this gallery in a gallery was quite important. And then we continued. We then kind of disappeared, went quiet for the month of August, and then became P exclamation again, but having reincorporated the kind of knowledge that came to us by having operated as a pseudo white cube space for 6 months. So some of P exclamation's key goals were made apparent, and others were intentionally hidden from sight. I'll just unpack that. That's to say that some of them, it was clear to me that there were certain mission principles that I had in the beginning that wouldn't work if I said that they were the principles or the mission of it. And so I kind of didn't talk about them until P was about to close. But these goals included to generate a space in which art, design, architecture, music, and writing could be presented in tandem and on an even playing field. To coalesce a context and audience for experimental exhibition making and display in New York, to challenge and reimagine the outmoded constructs of both the white cube and the alternative space, as well as provide a specific hybrid example, to intervene within existing modes of institutional communication and mediation, to support and promote the work of key polymathic practitioners, mostly older generation, who had wielded enormous cultural influence, but without commensurate recognition for their own independent accomplishments, to affect the historical record around the significance and perception of post-war design and reintegrate its legacy with that of contemporary art through exhibitions and artwork sales to museum collections, to demonstrate an aspirational model of economic fairness for a small New York art space through the establishment of artists' fees, and to create a spirit of transparency about all of these activities as a way to encourage other exhibition spaces. And this is probably overblown, and maybe Dulcie, Dulcie made a good point about trying not to be self-aggrandizing. So I hope this doesn't come off as that. But so to paraphrase Bertolt Brecht, our overly utopian goal was to make the world seem almost habitable every day. So that was kind of what we set out to do with P. And, you know, there's a lot to be said about beginnings and endings. I think one thing in this context, and maybe we can discuss more in the conversation, is it was always innately clear to me that P would exist for a limited period of time. I kind of went into it with these very utopian aspirations, and very quickly realized that both time and money and labor were going to be big questions. And so I never had the illusion that it would last forever. And I don't think it was meant to. I mean, for better or for worse, in that context, there are lots of people making exhibitions in New York and in other places. I think that it was meant to be a provocation. It was meant to try to demonstrate a set of ideas and perhaps like slightly tweak some variables. And in fact, maybe as a nice thing, by the time P closed in 2017, already some of the strategies that we had started to employ, or some of the things we had done, were no longer as foreign within the context of New York spaces of our scale. And that was an interesting and good thing to see. I will say, you know, this whole conference, and I kind of spoke about this in the very beginning of yesterday, it's a little bit of a personal bookend, or it's a bookend to this conversation that maybe started for me in 2016 when Tina Choi and Maria Lind invited me to be a participant at the Guangzhou Biennale Forum to all contributing factors, where they invited 100 small to medium scale institutions to spend a couple of days together thinking about their institutional models. And this was incredibly, I should say, it was incredibly generous of them to invite me, and very transformative for me as well, because it put me in contact with a lot of other spaces who were thinking about the kinds of problems we've been talking about. And one of the main things was that, and this is also even reflected in our program today, the rest of today, was that they put us into smaller groups and asked us to workshop questions of the reasons of having a small institution. I don't remember the prompt. I should have gone back and looked at it. But it's to say that they actually kind of allowed us to, so I was put in a group with institutions from Australia, New Zealand, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and somebody else from New York. And so, and as a group, we kind of workshopped the questions. We basically had like a group therapy session for half of a day and sat around and talked about the issues we were facing. It was incredibly useful. And we wrote a text together that was a kind of mock parody of establishing what we called the archives of institutional memory, a kind of an archive that would end up in Australia. And that was very specific, thinking about Neville Shute and on the beach and thinking about what might survive the end of the world, but the idea of putting together an archive of small to medium scale institutions archives that would be funded primarily by larger institutions. And we kind of wrote this as a text that was a provocation. And there was supposed to be a second book that would come out from the Guangzhou Biennale. That didn't happen in the end. But in a way, I see this conference as like the kind of bookend, or maybe the next phase, or maybe the next conversation for me after that. And so I'll just gonna read another text, and then I think I'm pretty much done. And hopefully some more things can come up in the Q&A. I always knew that P would end someday, at least in its original form. There was no way for it to sustain itself. Its frenetic energy, its fast pace, its intensive curatorial and artistic production, and its financial precarity made longevity impossible. Although I couldn't accurately predict its exact lifespan when I started, it was clear by year 4 that the experiment would end with the conclusion of our 5-year lease on our storefront on Broome Street in New York. And so P ended in 2017. On the one hand, this seemingly clear-cut ending allowed it to have a structure that could loop back on itself, that could mirror its start, and could, for me at the time, close with a kind of clarity and cleanness. But it did continue in another form when the final show at P, the artist Celine Condorelli's Epilogue, traveled to Stanley Picker Gallery at Kingston University, London, to become a new show called Prologue, restarting a chapter, a new beginning to the book. P! Also found itself reincarnated in a project called K, K, was a 1-year workshop for exhibition making that I established in 2018 in Berlin with the support of KW Institute for Contemporary Art. And that was really the first time somebody else had given external funding for the program. But this program and ever-changing exhibition function in many ways as the inverse of P. It was slow rather than fast, contemplative rather than hyperactive, focused on production rather than presentation. It was a necessary year to recover from P and chart next paths. And in any case, and this echoes something that Christine Thomas said yesterday and that really resonated with me. In any case, P exists still in many forms, in the traces it left in the world, not the least upon the bodies, the minds, the hearts, the practices of the people who participated in it and collaborated in it, including myself. And I'll end now with, now, and this is different from even when I wrote this text. Now I can say more clearly that P, although originally conceived to be finite and to have an end, it will live on in new forms in the coming years. It will become a pseudomorphic form of itself, less embodied in one particular space and program and person, but still active as an attitude. So it's reopening next week in Berlin, but in a different way, but with a similar name. So thank you.
Yeah, I guess pictures also speak a lot. So I don't know if we even need to add anything to this. But since we're here, I guess we dive headfirst into self-aggrandizement and
the sake of the artist represented there with his work. That's Petter Rollo's permanent installation, used to be permanent. Now it's dismantled, like a whole project. But yes.
Then we should also say that on the left it's Steffen Håndlykken, and yes. On the right is Stian Eide Kluge. And since 2015, 1857 has also been run by Jenny Kinge, who is not here. But when we started conceived of the project and started in almost exactly 10 years ago, in 2009, it was the two of us.
Yes. but yeah, back to the oven. No, I mean it's. I think it's just an excellent work. It's called A Burning House, and it has a sort of a conceptual background, which will take too many minutes to go into. But it's a functional wooden oven, and it's extremely practical in terms of not that we are like deliberately demolishing everything that we exhibit, but you know, a lot of the artworks or installations anyway has gone into that. So all right, so back in 2011, I guess it is, our fourth show was called Drop Handkerchief Backdrop, and yeah, it was a group show, and we just thought we would actually read the press release from that show, because we'd been 1 year into the program then, and we're like trying to figure out what we was and what we could be, and how to sort of address exhibition making, basically. So the press release is sort of about that. It also contains a very funny and tragic piece of history of human experiments. So buckle up. Yeah, it happened during the war, but I mean, this was in Sweden, and they were in part of the war, so don't confuse that anything with the World War II. So it runs thus. Until the middle of the last century, it was not known what actually caused cavities in teeth. In Sweden, it was a widespread problem, and in the 1940s, as many as 99.9% of the military conscripts, vernepliktige, had cavities. Though it was suspected that sugar played an important role, it was not yet scientifically confirmed. As a countermeasure, the government established a National Dental Service in 1945, and a set of experiments were initiated to root out any uncertainty. The location was Vipeholm Mental Hospital, housing several hundred patients that were to become part of the largest human experiment ever conducted in Scandinavia. The key element was to replace the regular meals with candy. Over the course of several years, the patients were fed copious amounts of candy and caramel, and some were even allowed and encouraged and forced, I think if I remember correctly, to eat as much as they wanted at any time of day. The experiment was a huge success, and eventually led to a full understanding of the effect of sugar on teeth. Furthermore, it prompted a concise formula for the necessary elements in the formation of dental caries, namely the inclusion of the following: sugar, bacteria, thyme, and teeth. By removing any of these four components, you will not form cavities. And then it ends by, in brackets, cavities are usually understood as negative space, but are in reality soft spots on the teeth. And that's that. I just want to quickly point out that it was my fascist dentist. He really is a fascist. That told this anecdote, and he thought it was a tip-top experiment. Furthermore, it's also a little bit funny for the local audience that this is actually where the concept of lørdagsgodt, Saturday candy, comes from. So you've all, you are all part of the inheritance of this. Yeah, so you probably get it. I mean, like this was sort of a metaphorical a model for what we thought. I mean, a very reductionistic one, obviously, but a way to think about exhibition making and any gallery practice or art making defined by certain criteria. And then I would maybe say that our program then has been about trying to remove these or alter this and see then what happens, and how many of them you could sort of take away or transform dramatically, and then you will still have these you'll still have in people's minds a contemporary art exhibition with works, dates, space, titles, and so forth.
Yeah, as might be clear, we got into this project as two artists finding ourselves in a big industrial space with sort of a large canvas to make exhibitions on, and the program developed sort of in equal parts as a response to the space and to the artists that we invited. So for this particular group show titled "Drop Handkerchief Backdrop," with David Keating and Christian Tonner and Vanessa Billy and George Brack. They were the artists in the show, but then we collaborated with them and also inserted ourselves in different ways into the display of the works, and some of the program came from this idea of using the different formats that are available in exhibition making as sort of an artistic medium that as artists running an exhibition space we would not sort of have access to the artworks that were being shown or to making art in the exhibition space, but we would sort of be in charge of all the other elements, the titles, the press releases or different introductions to the show, the sort of graphical elements that we developed with a lot of input from our designer Ian Brown and his partner Lynn Eriksen, and then also a lot of the projects came in response to the crumbling concrete walls and ceiling and even rooftop of this space. Even most of the solo shows were at least partly produced on site in the space, which was partly a way to save on shipping costs, which is practically here at the very edge of the world. But it also gives a lot of local flavor in a way to the exhibitions, and I guess also a lot of know-how over the years on our parts and all the different people who's helped us with production over the years. The direction of the program was supplied, I guess, by this ethos, but also the input from the artists who were visiting and who would offer suggestions and their contacts and different contexts or gossip or just leave good ideas around for us to pick up later.
I mean, just sort of like the to pin it down like on a timeline. So we started 2010, we ended it last year, I think, but we have, I mean, it didn't end abruptly, or we had some sort of a transitional period.
We're on our last ropes, as you might be able to tell.
But for those of you who haven't been there, and since it's only this image, it's like a huge woods what's it called, like wood storage space hall in downtown Oslo, which is really weird and fascinating in itself. Like a shoebox, like a concrete shoebox with skylights, and so a beautiful space. And no, of course, we just got that accidentally. It could have been anything we imagined to move into and make a basic white cube, I guess. Maybe that's a little bit important too, since like it's not like we're coming from the complete periphery, but at the same time, it sort of felt like that back in 2010. As Steffen mentioned, the it wasn't difficult to include artists or like invite artists and have them actually accept and come. We had a good setup with our arts council money and stuff, as well as just offering shows and also in an interesting space. But then we sort of had to, we sort of had to tap onto, well, it's not true that we had to tap onto them. We could like do our own research, but it sort of grew from like one artist to the next, and then we formed sort of a milieu of people and collaborators, and not surprisingly, most of them or a lot of them would come from Berlin. And that together with that air ticket, like flight tickets, was then like suddenly very, very cheap. That made that was also an important component for the whole coming together of the project. But yeah, so we have existed in 10 years. We are now on our last year. We don't have the space anymore. We are still obliged to complete a certain program because of this Arts Council funding and sort of an obligation to the artists. We have sort of promised to complete their shows. But as of Periphery, it sort of felt, I mean, we've gained quite a lot of attention, but and also we've been traveling abroad and participated in fairs the last 4 years. To a more or less success, but at least we've been part of like the milieu then out there in Europe or the States, and it feels like for the other projects or like the other people that have talked here now, that okay, you are maybe run it for like 2 years or 4 years or 5 years, and you end it, and you still made an impact, like even an impact internationally or like more or less, and way not just locally. And for us, it always felt that we had to, I mean, maybe keep it going longer. It like the gratification process took longer, I would say, for us to actually, expect to be recognized when we mentioned our gallery name abroad or in fairs.
Yeah, I think the motivation. We should maybe warn, that we should round this off now. But we could, like, the motivation in the beginning was that we wanted to see a different kind of show in Oslo, and we thought that it would be in a way like baking art, that it would be quite easy and it would be up to anyone to do it, and that sense has changed now since 2010, and there's a lot more going on, and the needs of the city has also changed a bit, and that's for the good, and it's maybe not only because of us, but anyway, it's like a better situation. So maybe that's also a good place to leave it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much for all your presentations. Super insightful and surprising in many respects. A lot of things I didn't expect here, and I'm happy heard. Yeah, just excellent points. Before I start, I wanted to say something that a point I wanted to bring up, which hasn't been discussed, and we made a point of not really discussing it, or making a point in the conference, and that is economy. We did so for a number of reasons. I think for me, one of the main reasons is that whenever I've been involved in these kinds of conversations and economy comes up, it just kind of takes over the conversation, especially in these meetings I organized in Arco Madrid. It just felt like you just end up talking only about money. And that can be interesting or productive to a certain degree. And discussing with Rhea earlier, she brought up a very good point as well, is that, and maybe not everyone will agree with this, I'm not sure, but at least for me, and I think many of my colleagues in this respect, it wasn't really a consideration. Like, for instance, when I started Lulu in Mexico City, we weren't like, how much money do we have? What are we going to do? We're like, let's start a space. And then we thought about money later, and then it became an issue. And I feel like a lot of us are crazy enough to think this way. Otherwise, a lot of the spaces probably wouldn't happen. So, yeah. So I just wanted to get that out there on the table. But it does seem, nevertheless, to be a subject in this last panel, something that was touched upon in a number of different presentations. I guess one question I would like to start with, which is for almost everyone here, is the question of the actual space. Because I feel like to differing degrees, and this has been touched upon in different points of the conference, like to what extent is a space a group of people behind the institution, or to what extent is a space indivisible from its founder and director? And I think that brings up the question, of to what extent is a space necessary to run a space? I mean, it sounds like a bit of a paradox, but I think something like with what you do, Prem, that P exclamation was more a physical manifestation of like ongoing preoccupations and things you were thinking about. As you said, for you, it was like a way to demonstrate ideas. But the physical space ended, but I don't think it's actually ended. So I'm wondering for you guys, like to what extent, and I think you already answered this question, Dulcie, but to what extent for you is a space important to having a physical space to having a space?
Yeah, since since this is also partly an exercise in patting our own backs, I'd like to bring up a compliment that we got years ago from an artist that we showed, who, because everyone came into this sort of monumental cathedral-like space that Stian was describing, and people were going on and on about it, also to the artist, and he said, yeah, the space is good enough, but the guys who's running it, they're really good. Like, they're what matters. And it's a fantastic compliment, but it's also, I think it's very true, and it's something that we sort of you feel as the space becomes the face of the project in many ways. But on the other hand, the space was sort of the driving force in making most of the projects happen, and sort of a direct inspiration for the shows. And then when we lost the lease of the space, and we finally sort of got the chance to prove that it was really about us and not about the address, we went through a lot of options for different spaces. And I guess what we found, like upon reflection, is that working together in this space as three quite different with different ideas, they maybe sort of grown apart, or we had different focuses. So that, again, finding somewhere that could be like a focus or a nexus for the three of us turned out to be sort of impossible or not really productive. So that the space also formed as sort of a kind of body for our ideas that sort of had to be there, I think, before we started, in order for us to develop.
Yeah, maybe just pointing out also, I mean, we're both artists, and at least the way I think we both felt it, I did anyway, is that okay, so we started doing this project. Of course, we meant to do our artistic practices like simultaneously, so it was never meant to be on the expense of that. You could say that there are like different sort of what's it called, like driving forces. one is to, you know, do something for the public and or do something from the scene and the city you're within, and the other, of course, is to gain or get like or create attention around your own practice, or like around your own person, so they come to the space and you can sort of divert attention towards you instead. That wasn't so successful for us, I guess. Maybe also maybe because the space, I mean, was so significant and particular and weird, and yeah, it demanded like large, or it suggested large scale projects, and then we sort of dove into that. But my point was really to say that yeah, so I think like our creative aspirations were then just like channeled right into the space. So sort of our creative drive was then like you know, got its like fulfillment with working with the space, and then after a while, as trying to returning back to our own practices, then that drive maybe wasn't there anymore in the same degree, you know.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. This colleague of mine, Alexander Koch, has written a lot about artists who have withdrawn, and he is something of an expert on this. And he created this criteria, and one of his criterion was that it had to be somebody who left the field of art entirely. It couldn't be somebody who became a gallerist or something like that. And I think it's a very astute criterion in that they are kind of the same thing. I mean, they're very different, but I think they kind of respond to similar needs and kind of fulfill similar, I don't know, desires. But yeah, Thomas?
The question about the space. So this, in our case, the space was there before us. I mean, in the sense, well, the space made us, in the sense that we were using the space as a shared office for like almost a year, and a shared office. Like we were not even like talking much to one another. It was like I was running a publishing house, another one called Metronome Press, and so I needed a space to just like store boxes of books. François had been running an institution, Le Laboratoire de Bervilliers, for some years and wanted to start like a curatorial freelance practice. And Oscar had just met his future wife and arrived in Paris, knew no one besides me, and so hanging out in this space. And the thing is that this space was a former gallery. So basically we had tables and, you know, computers in this space, but the space was telling us, well, you know, you could use it also. It's still like a small, it used to be a gallery, so it had white walls. And at some point, this is how it became. One night we discussed, Oscar had an idea for an exhibition, and then we imagined this like one exhibition, and we gave it a name for the space, but we had no idea. But so the space existed, and then the space made a lot for the project. Define most of the parameters of the project, and the way we worked, the fact that it was isolated in Paris. Somehow at the time in Belleville there were not that much going on, so there were very few people passing by, and so this is what decided us to do like a bookstore, for instance, because once you get there, but well, you can also do something else, which is like browse through books and talk. So everything that, you know, made Castillo Corrales was because of that particular space. And we didn't decide. I mean, we didn't decide. It's just like it was there.
It just happened.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's indivisible from the space. Prem, you want to say a word or two about that, or? I actually have a different question for you, but. No, but go ahead. No, I mean.
No, I mean, I did discuss it somewhat. I suppose I just would add that thinking about the way that you can survive, but transition and yeah, develop and evolve, is that we've changed spaces. So the original raw building we had until 2016, and then in 2016 we moved into our new building that I showed you, and we located the residency elsewhere, and that happened with the change in our programmatic focus to the academy. So and also wanting to do something much more deliberate with the residency. So yeah, we're changing while we're now in this space. It's been 3 years. We are renovating, as you know, when we can, to do with what makes sense for our program. Our library is growing, so we're building a bigger library. And that's a way of, I suppose, resolving to keep on responding. A physical space can do that.
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's weird. I realize it's like one has one's own blinders in a way. I mean, I think for one thing, in New York, space is such an expensive commodity that even the decision to take a space was like a very intentional one, and it was thankfully still reasonably cheap at the time that I took it, but it was like a important decision, and so somehow I actually think, like, until you just asked that question, or until very recently, I've always associated P with the space. And so it was kind of, there wasn't even a question to me that when the lease ran out, because I didn't want to renew the lease, that P would end then. And so that was the kind of way I thought about it. And then I think I started sometime last year to think about, well, okay, maybe I need to come up with some kind of name for more like a kind of office of exhibition making, or like a way to articulate the group of people, many of whom who were part of P2, whether I should actually mention Judith Gertner, who is here, who also worked on the graphic design for this conference, but other people like Sarah Demuse, who's a curator, and people who were constant, dialogical partners of mine who had been part of P somehow, but like there wasn't a name. And sometimes we'd work on projects not at P, but there wasn't a way to name that thing. And then I think it only very recently occurred to me that, I mean, it's like sometimes the most obvious answer is in front of you, that maybe P could exist, though its name is a little bit different now, but maybe it could exist and it could just become a slightly different organization. It can grow, it can live, it doesn't have to be linked to being a space for exhibition making or a space for presentation and display. It can actually be a group of people, or a group of interests, or a group of concerns, or a kind of broader mission that may not be as located in one particular thing. But that's a relatively recent realization.
And Dulcie, to kind of building on that question or on the back of it, it seems like, the mission of raw material has changed and become, as you said, more focused on this kind of raw material academy. It's taken on a much more pedagogical mission and focus, abandoning exhibition making altogether. And I'm wondering, like, what's the end goal? What's the hope of that kind of pedagogy? Is it, is it to educate an art audience or to create artists? And if so, do you see, or does the institution see itself ultimately returning to exhibition making?
So it's an interesting question, I think. We haven't actually abandoned exhibition making. We opened an exhibition half an hour before I left to come here. So we're very much still doing exhibitions, but they are just not our main programmatic focus.
Okay.
Right. So, but it's important because now we're doing exhibitions in a different way, because our timing, our calendar year is defined by the academy. So we do have somewhat less flexibility in that sense. With regards to the goal, I think that the mission of RAW remains the same, which is to develop and to nurture a healthy society through art making and art practice, and through the ways that art can relate to society and come into interaction with it. And what we just saw is that over time is that doing exhibitions alone in Dakar was not getting the job done, and that we needed to nurture a wider ecosystem, because when you're in a context where there are not curators, there are not art historians, and where, as I said, the School of Fine Arts is somewhat limited, one art center churning out exhibitions all year is a drop in the ocean. And so it became necessary to help to develop like a younger generation of people working across the field and contributing in different ways to the field so that we could have a stronger field. And we do in the academy try to have 50% of our fellows, we call them, from the African continent, but this is flexible and the rest come from all over the world. So it's an investment in our local context, in the continent's context, but also in trying to nurture wider networks. What will happen next? We don't know yet, but we won't do the academy forever, because we hope that, we've now got 60 alumni, and because we've done 6 sessions, and we hope that, and we see that they're getting things done, they're getting the work done. So we won't do the academy forever, and we're already thinking and beginning to research, beginning question what the next stage will be. But I think always with this same commitment to the idea that we can have better societies if we have art and if we have different ways of engaging with art. And then how can we best fulfill that mission given what our landscape looks like?
Yeah, indeed. So the idea is to kind of generate or help generate an ecosystem in Dakar. Yeah. I seem to have a lot of good questions here. Maybe I can, this one is interesting. I'm going to read this one. I guess this is for everyone. A lot of these are for everyone. This one is: dependent institutions report to donors, funders, government bodies. What about independent institutions? Does independent apply unaccountability? If not, who are they accountable to and in what ways? And then lastly, it ends with, is it not selfish to die? So I don't know who wants to take that one first.
Well, I think what you said earlier is for me, is a valid answer to this. It depends on the context where you are. I mean, for us, for instance, in Paris, it doesn't make much of a difference if we die, if we disappear. Even on the contrary, I mean, not to just say that we were important, but somehow it also gives like space to others to do projects in a way, and this has always been part of, what we were inspired by many other like-minded institutions that exist. I mean, organization projects that existed before, and it has always been part of our idea is to do this, to inspire others to work differently and to imagine things differently. And it was nice for us. I mean, I don't think it was selfish to just say, we just end here.
Yeah.
That's my answer to this. But in the Paris context.
And my understanding of the Paris context is that it actually did have a really positive impact. Like, not
closing, you mean?
Well, I mean, I guess more, I wasn't actually thinking about that, but more the fact that Castillo Corrales existed, that it did help inspire other institutions run by curators and artists. And I like this idea of like leaving the playing field open for others, like, or leaving the stage so others can enter it. But,
I mean, every end is a beginning. And I mean, sometimes they're good beginnings, sometimes they're bad beginnings. But even thinking about organisms, if every organism lived forever, in a way, I would actually argue they do, in the sense that everything is permanent. Everything both has something that predates it and something that comes after it, some effects that it leaves, whether material, spiritual, or, kind of intellectual, or however you want to produce that. But I do think that, yeah, I mean, it's like the question of, is it selfish to die, is like, I think that everything both dies and doesn't die. And so I think that it leaves space for other things, and it makes another beginning. The question of accountability is interesting because I think that it is, I tend with P, I don't talk about P as an independent art institution. I never have used that language particularly because I think that everything is dependent. But I think the question about accountability is a very good one. But I would say, I would kind of deflect, or at least say that I think there's as much a question of accountability to others as to oneself as well. And that may be selfish, but I think it's like one's own sustainability is an important question because it allows one to continue and to be generous or to give back to other contexts in a way. So
yeah, it's a difficult to name what like all of us, all of our spaces, what we are in common. And then for this conference, I guess the choice was independent spaces, and it sort of obscures the fact that we, like in what we have all been describing here, is that we are extremely dependent on our local context and on our local art communities, and those are the audiences that we serve, and sometimes we are working. We have sort of missions or responsibilities to them, and sometimes we have like bonds of friendship or colleagues that make us dependent. So in that sense, we are, in a way, we sort of we all belong in different places more than we belong together, I think. And then if we can still find like common ground to talk about the similarities, I think that's what we stand to gain from meeting like this.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how long we live and when we die, though, I mean, not to try to be smart, but it doesn't feel like dying. It's more like retiring, and retiring is not really selfish, I think. Yeah, I mean, Chris, we spoke briefly about this yesterday. I don't know what the answer to this is for us, but it's like, I think it has to do with some sort of the idea of the impact you are making within the community you are. I guess we shouldn't complain. I mean, we got attention quickly and have had like, an interested audience and stuff. But in terms of gratification, it also is like, to me, it's very like tangible how many people actually come and see the shows. Because you have no idea how many see the shows online, and today that's a valid way of orienting yourself in the art world, acquiring taste and everything. Yeah, I mean, like as a small institution, still with a generous funding, but still, like a 2-man band or 3-man band. I felt always that we were very the idea of the impact we made on the community was very important for us. I think actually how many people come and see the shows, physical people,
Actual people,
yeah,
real people.
yes.
With regards to the question of dependence and independence, I would agree that we're all dependent. We're all dependent. We're all interdependent. All of us in different ways. And for us, and I touched on it in the presentation, as there has been this real fight to help donors to understand that they also depend on us, and that there is machinery in place. They need us as much as we need them. And in the context of working in West Africa, where a lot of funding bodies don't think like this, where they think that they're doing everyone a huge favor, it's really important that we let them know that they wouldn't have.
And it's mutual.
Exactly. And so it's not always easy, and you have to find funders who understand this or who are receptive to trying out working in this way. And in concrete terms, this means that we try as much as possible to, as I said, secure like institutional funding, as opposed, and say you have confidence in us. And yeah, it's not always easy. There are a lot of donors who don't understand that and who don't want to work like that. But the Arts Collaboratory Network that we're part of, which is funded by Boutoux, is an example of trying out new methods of funding. And yeah, we are all interdependent, as opposed to independent or dependent, I guess.
Yeah, that's an excellent way of putting it, for sure. The mutual dependence. I have another question, which is a question of accountability. It's talking about this again, which I think is interesting. What are the ethics of mission articulation? Do all spaces need to edit and refine and express clear parameters? Yes, no. For me, this kind of, that answers the question of accountability to a certain degree, in the sense that, it depends on your mission. Like, you're accountable to your mission. Like, how clear is your mission, and to what extent does it evolve, and do you continue to be accountable to it? But what do you guys think? Who wants to talk about that one?
You want to go?
I guess an easy answer for our part would be that since the first year we started, this gets into funding again, because it has to do with the mission statements that go along with application writing. But since the first year we started, there was this funding scheme set up by the Arts Council after lobby work from UKS that was meant to secure institutional funding for artist-run spaces after a lot of these spaces having been reliant on like project-to-project funding. And a good thing about it is that there were like quite few strings attached in like regards to audience numbers or things like that. So it was like to fit in with that funding scheme, one would need to be like create new art in a way, and then with sort of added purpose of the funding, which is maybe more problematic in this context, that it should lead to professionalization of these art spaces. So, and this is also something that we've been as you do politely, always sort of thank for the generous funding. But this is like professionalization also in a context where the funding is sort of, it's a lot for an art project, but it's a lot less, or it's about half initially for what you would need to have one full-time position in a way. So it's also a question of how you become a professional if you don't have a job, or like you don't and that's something that you should go with most understandings of being professional, I guess. But those thankfully, in a way, our accountability to this Arts Council, which is then the Norwegian taxpayers, would then be to deliver something that is experimental and that sort of pushes the boundaries on exhibition making, and that's I guess something that we've had in mind, and I think has been more acute than counting how many people came in the door.
Well, in our case, we didn't have we never asked for public funding, so we never had this we never had to fill anything, and again, it took us years to figure out what was it that we were doing and what did we like so much about it, but since the beginning of the space, at the very beginning of the space, we knew that we wanted to be a bit confusing also. So for I think the first 2 years, we came up for each project with a new description of what we were doing, so we never had any mission, and we played with this also to the need for people to just know exactly who you are, what you're doing, and how is it going to evolve. And we wanted to resist this instant, commodification or definition of what it is that you're doing, especially when you have no idea, and to take time to just figure things out and play a little bit also with these, the expectations. Why are people expecting anything from this from the spaces? And this is a question that we always had to answer, and so we played a lot with this. And actually, the funny thing, I could have talked about this, the first show, we described it as our last show, and we came up with this like very silly description of what we were doing, saying that the story of the space would be a story like going backwards to the beginning of it, but it was just a joke about, it was the time it was like there were so many like what I call reflexive curating, like people just inventing new rules and things like this, and we found it like a bit ridiculous, and so we just made this, description of the space, saying that we were, every show would go to explain the story going backwards, and people just believed it. And all this like boys club of reflexive curator, some of them wrote to us and say, very interesting, very good idea. And then like a month after we changed, and we played like this for like 2 years, but no mission. No, we never had one.
I mean, I guess the question's an interesting one. I mean, in some levels, I guess I'll differentiate between, on the one hand, I have an answer as me or P or something, but I actually wouldn't want it to exclude other answers. Like, I don't think that everybody needs to have a very clear mission, because I think that would be a little boring. Like, if everybody communicated and everybody were articulate about all of their intentions all the time, though I'm a big fan of transparency, in some ways, like, part of it is the process of articulating what you're doing and the feedback loop of learning as you're doing it. I mean, on the one hand, P was never publicly funded, and it was a private organization, but it did kind of come out of the gate with a very kind of, or at least from, maybe it's not clear for me, like a clear mission statement. But on the other hand, that mission statement was really intuitive at that time. Like, I kind of made that statement actually, and then it's only now, if I'm like reading it 7 years later, I'm like, oh, okay, I now understand much better. Maybe it's like the inverse of yours, that it was literally, and I'm not going to tell the whole anecdote, but in the very last show, in the very last program that P did in New York, was the moment in which the entire reason for P existing became clear to me, where like I understood why, like, all of the people whom I had met and the conversations I had had, and that mission actually coalesced literally in one conversation around the political ideology of exhibition display and a certain piece by Herbert Bayer that and his Nazi past that he tried to excise from his autobiography. And it's too much to get into, but just to say, sometimes you say things and they're intuitive, and then it takes you a long time to actually understand where they come from and why they come from. And then that can also change, but it's maybe, for me at least, that process of trying to understand where you come from, and like that kind of auto-ethnographic impulse to understand your own motivation, that for me is what's meaningful.
I've sort of forgotten the question a bit, but accountability. I mean, I think that there's one can have, a very clear mission and also have lots of room for experimentation. But yeah, I think accountability is really important. Accountability to whom? To ourselves, to our audience. Who is our audience? Like, these are really important questions. But I do believe that having a mission is important. And I don't know who said it, but that if you don't stand up for something, you fall down. And so I think we all have a responsibility, and especially once you start working with a public, you absolutely should know what you're doing, or should know why you're trying. Actually, probably is a better way. You should know why you're trying to do what you do.
Well, it's an interesting kind of heterogeneity of points of view and positions, but yeah, I mean, all really equally inspiring and thoughtful. I think that's probably a good place to end. I still have some really good questions here. Hopefully they can be incorporated into the conference afterwards, but I think now we're going to take a coffee break.
No, first, we're not going to take a coffee break. We're going to jump in, and then everybody does both.
Yeah, well, we're going to take a coffee break, which is going to become
active.
Yeah, this is.
Sorry, I don't mean to be grabby on the mic, Chris. No, what we're going to do is, because we felt like if we now said go take a coffee break, we might lose some people, whereas what we'd really love, and it's voluntary, is that we actually continue this discussion but in smaller groups, and to kind of workshop this in a way for a short period of time. The people who have been involved in all of these discussions as speakers, but the other people in the room, some of whom I hope have been contributing questions or asked questions, but to actually kind of open that up. So if you're with us, then let's all stand up for a second. And what we're going to do is just basically break up into smaller groups and go away for a little and talk about a set of questions we have, and then come back and kind of present to the group, discuss with the group these things. So I'd like to just go around and everybody kind of count a number from 1 to 8 in sequence. Do you want to just start?
1, 2,
3,
4, 5,
6.
7,
8, 1,
2,
3, 4,
5,
6,
7.
8.
And remember your number, of course.
1, 2,
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
2,
3.
5, 2.
Okay.
Do I have to count in ascending order?
We're creating our keep going. Let's keep going. 2.
4, 5, 6,
7, 1,
8,
8,
2,
3, 5, 6, 7,
8.
1, 2, 3.
Okay, so can we have all the one? Can we kind of all join? Come down here for a second, and then the ones gather in one corner of the room. Remember your number. The 2s, just kind of find your people. 6, 6.
No, 6. I'm 5.
2.
So let's group here. I will consider that. 4, 2.
Of course. Okay.
2.
Here I am.
2.
People are jumping our number and they say different numbers, so we look like very small. What number are you?
That's a better presentation. I did understand. You have all the answers.
Up my sleeve. Just wrote them all down.
Okay. So,
Maybe you do the
okay.
do the
So hopefully everyone found their people. So sorry, we could have done it with letters. We could have, but numbers seemed easy. Okay, so it's a really straightforward prompt. What we'd like everyone to do is go with your people and sit down, have a coffee. There are lots of spaces throughout the building that the UKS staff can help you find, and discuss, perhaps introduce yourselves, and perhaps discuss 2 questions. The first, which is a very big question, but what would be the ideal institution? Okay. And I think that necessitates probably a lot of criteria, but so we wanted to also open the question that remains unanswered in some ways, like what would be the measure of success? And is that a valid criteria? But to discuss that. And I think the goal is that each group, if you can kind of, one person who's ideally not a speaker, not somebody who has spoken at the conference, can be a kind of facilitator and maybe be a spokesperson for the group, and to discuss this until exactly 4 o'clock. So exactly 4 o'clock, and then come back here and give a kind of very short, like 2-3 minute, like summary of what your group thought about. There's no conclusion here, but it's an opportunity to share these things. We also have some big paper and pens and things, if that's a useful thing for the facilitator.
And just to say a little bit on the big paper, pen, and facilitation. So basically, you can be in the cafe, of course, but we also have 3 different spaces that you could divide into, and the 4th space. One is Pakkerummet, it's behind the kind of exhibition space adjacent. There's one that's Direktionsrummet, which is up on the 1st floor, and there's one that's called Atelier Felix. If your group wants to go into either of these rooms, you got to find either Lieve or Kaya or Rodrigo over here, and Lieve and Kaya and Rodrigo will also find paper and pen and make sure that each of the 1 to 8 groups has that. So if you sit somewhere else, someone will come and give you a paper in your hand and a touche. And yeah, back here, 4 p.m. Coffee is where you know it is, and great.
Thanks. Okay, see you guys all in 45 minutes. Enjoy.